September 1st, 1983, a passenger plane departs from New York carrying 269 people on board, families, children, and even a sitting U.S. congressman, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. The pilot makes a small navigation error, and the plane quietly drifts into Soviet airspace. A Soviet fighter jet locks onto it. 2 missiles are fired. Within 12 seconds, Korean Airlines Flight 007 is gone. Now here is the thing that stayed with me when I read about this. Before that flight took off, many of those passengers had done something that humans have always done before high-stakes moments. They prayed, some kissed a cross, some whispered quietly to God, some simply sat with their eyes closed for a moment. And despite all of that, they still died. So the question I want to explore in this video is not whether prayer works. The real question is far more interesting than that. Why do humans pray at all? Why has every single civilization in recorded history, without a single exception, created gods? Think about how remarkable that actually is. The ancient Egyptians had Ra. The Greeks had Zeus, the Aztecs had Huitzilopochtli, the Vikings had Odin. And today, roughly 84% of the world's 8 billion people identify with some form of religion. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And science has finally started to explain why. What makes this genuinely puzzling is that these civilizations were not copying each other. The Aztecs and the ancient Egyptians never met. The Vikings and the Hindus never exchanged manuscripts. And yet they all independently arrived at the same destination: invisible agents, supernatural forces, and rituals to communicate with powers you cannot see. For a long time, the easy explanation was that people believed because they simply didn't know better. The assumption was that science would replace religion and that education would be the cure. Except that explanation falls apart the moment you look at the data. A 2022 Pew Research survey found that 80% of Americans still believe in God or a higher power. In Japan, a country that is deeply secular both by law and culture, belief in spirits, fate, and the supernatural remains remarkably high. So, the form of belief changes from culture to culture, but the underlying need for it never seems to go away. The question is not why ancient people believed. The question is why modern educated people never stop. In the late 1990s, a cognitive scientist named Justin Barrett at Oxford University came up with a concept that genuinely changed how researchers think about this. He called it the Hyperactive Agency Detection Device, or HAD for short. And to understand what that means, imagine going back about 100,000 years to when your ancestor is walking alone through a dense forest. Suddenly they hear something, let's say the rustling of leaves or the snapping of a branch somewhere nearby. In that moment, they essentially have 2 choices. The first option is to assume it's nothing, maybe just the wind or a small animal, and keep walking. The second option is to assume something dangerous is out there and take action immediately. Now think carefully about what happens in each case. If your ancestor chooses option 1 and they're wrong, if there actually was a predator hiding in those bushes, they are dead. But if they choose option 2 and they're wrong, the only thing they've lost is maybe 30 seconds of walking time. Evolution, over thousands of generations, made a very simple and logical calculation here. It is far better to see danger everywhere and occasionally be wrong than to miss a real threat, even once. And so our brains became wired to detect agents, to look for intentions, familiar faces, and hidden causes, even in places where none actually exist. That's why you see a face in the pattern of clouds. That's why you sometimes feel like someone is watching you in an empty room. That's why you occasionally think you hear your name in the background noise of a busy place. That is HAD firing in your brain. And once your brain detects what feels like an agent, it immediately needs to explain it. Who is this? What does it want? Can I somehow communicate with it? This, according to researchers, is where the idea of God was born. Not from ignorance, not from fear alone, but from a survival mechanism that was so effective, it simply never switched off. Now, cognitive scientists have mapped out 3 specific mental systems that work together to generate religious belief. And what's fascinating is that these systems appear in every culture on Earth without exception. The first one is agent detection, which we just talked about. The tendency of the brain to see intention and purpose everywhere, especially when something bad or unexplained happens. When a village floods or a child dies, the brain instinctively looks for a cause with a will behind it because randomness feels unbearable. The second system is something called theory of mind. This is your brain's extraordinary ability to model what other people are thinking and feeling. You use it every single day without realizing it. When you wonder what your boss really meant by a comment, or when you try to figure out what a friend's silence means, or when you read someone's expression across a room, once you have the ability to imagine the inner world of another mind, you can also do it for minds you cannot see. Spirits, ancestors, gods. Religious belief in this sense is not irrational at all. It is theory of mind directed toward the invisible. The third system is perhaps the most powerful one: the brain's deep, almost desperate need for control. Researchers at Cornell University once ran a study where they made participants feel a loss of control by exposing them to random and meaningless images. Then they asked asked those same participants to find patterns in visual noise. The people who had been made to feel out of control found significantly more patterns than the others. They saw hidden connections, conspiracies, and meaning in things that were purely random. The human brain simply cannot tolerate the idea that the universe has no order. So when it cannot find order, it creates it. And a God who controls everything becomes the most satisfying answer possible to a world that refuses to make sense on its own. Now I want to tell you about a moment that, to me, makes all of this absolutely undeniable. It is 1969 and Apollo 11 has just landed on the moon. Before Neil Armstrong delivers his famous words, his fellow astronaut Buzz Aldrin does something that almost nobody talks about. He quietly reaches into his personal kit and pulls out a small plastic bag. Inside it is a tiny cup, a small vial of wine, and a piece of bread. He reads a scripture passage to himself in silence. He takes communion alone on the surface of the moon, nearly 384,000 kilometers from Earth. He later described it by saying that he simply wanted to give thanks privately, just for that one moment. Now sit with that for a second. Buzz Aldrin was arguably one of the most technically trained human beings alive at that point. He had just accomplished something no human being had ever done. By any measure, he had every reason to feel completely in control of his situation. And yet his very first instinct at the peak of human achievement was to reach for something ancient, something invisible, something that felt bigger than himself. Why? Because stepping onto the surface of another world is the single highest uncertainty environment any human being has ever entered. And the brain, under conditions of maximum uncertainty, reaches for exactly what it was built to reach for. The agent detector fires. The need for control fires. Theory of mind fires. Belief does not fade when people become more educated or more capable. If anything, it activates most intensely when the stakes are at their absolute highest. And this isn't just about one astronaut. A 2018 study published in the journal Religion, Brain, and Behavior analyzed 60 different societies, ranging from isolated hunter-gatherer communities in the Amazon rainforest all the way to modern nations. Every single one of those societies had developed some concept of supernatural agents, including communities that had never had any contact with organized religion. This tells us something important. This is not the result of cultural transmission or religious education. This is a feature built into the human brain itself. And when researchers looked at what that belief actually does for people, the results were striking. A Harvard study that tracked 74,000 individuals over 20 years found that people who regularly participated in religious practice had a 33% lower risk of death during the study period, along with significantly lower rates of depression and suicide, and a stronger reported sense of purpose in life, not because religion is magic, but because belief consistently does 4 specific things for the human brain. It reduces anxiety by telling the brain that someone bigger is in charge. It gives meaning to suffering, and pain with a clear purpose is far more survivable than pain that feels pointless. It creates community, and belonging to a group is one of the strongest predictors of both mental health and how long you live. And it provides a moral framework, shared rules, rituals, and identity that reduce the exhausting mental burden of making every decision from scratch. These are not small or trivial benefits. These are survival advantages, and evolution does not allow survival advantages to quietly disappear. That said, none of this is an argument that God exists or doesn't exist. That is a deeply personal and philosophical question, and it is not one this video is trying to answer. What the science is saying is something more specific and more interesting. The capacity for belief is not a flaw in human thinking. It is a deeply conserved feature of the human mind, and like any powerful feature, it can be directed well or badly. The same instinct that sends aid workers into disaster zones can send someone to harm others in the name of faith. The same brain that raises cathedrals has at other points in history burned people alive in their shadow. The difference is not the belief itself. The difference is whether that belief is held with curiosity and humility, or used as a tool to avoid questioning, to exclude others, or to justify harm. So here's what the science actually tells us. Humans did not invent God because they were simple or frightened. Humans invented God because they were equipped with a brain designed to detect meaning, resist the terror of randomness, and build communities around shared purpose. That same brain gave us language, agriculture, science, art, and every religion ever recorded in human history. The question was never really whether people should believe. The question is what you do with belief once you have it. Buzz Aldrin took communion on the surface of the moon, and then he put the cup away, stepped through the hatch, and walked on it. He did not choose between the ancient and the rational. He carried both. And perhaps that is exactly the point. The brain that reaches toward God in a moment of total uncertainty and the brain that designs a rocket capable of escaping Earth's gravity are not opposites. They are the same brain, doing the same thing it has always done, trying its very best to make sense of a universe it will never fully understand. Thanks for watching, and hit that like and subscribe button.